Feels like it's Ducati time. The three of you that care about this bike are probably wondering what's been up with it. It hasn't been in a video for a while, and the reason for that is because it's been absolutely perfect and nothing's gone wrong. Actually, I've been working on it constantly, but it's all been boring stuff that I've done before that wouldn't make for a very good video. Let me explain. The problem I was having initially that made me stop riding the bike was that I would stop riding it for a little while to go into a store or something out, and I'd come back out and the carbs would be flooded full of gas. And the main reason for that is because the needle for the float was not sealing properly and fuel was just constantly coming into the carbs. Now, that's fairly common on old bikes, and the usual solution is to just turn off the fuel valve or the fuel petcock. But on this bike, the fuel petcock is up under the fuel tank, and you have to take the seat off and lift the tank up, and then it's a screw up in here that you tighten, and that doesn't seal either. That always goes bad. So what I did is I got a little MGO inline fuel shutoff, and I zip tied it to the frame there in line with the fuel line, and of course that worked great. What apparently doesn't work great is this seal around my oil cap. There's actually fuel leaking out from tipping this up. I might have to find a new one of those. Just throw more money at it. So once I fixed that, I thought I was pretty much good to go and keep riding it. I also relined the fuel tank with red coat after stripping it out completely with some acetone. I then red coated it. It was a big process. It was quite boring to watch, but coating a strangely shaped tank like this is not an easy proposition. So I had all that done. I went and rode it. I swapped out this K&N filter for a factory filter because I had a hunch that the jetting on this was set up for a factory filter and that the restriction will actually produce more power. That was a correct assumption, actually. The bike was much peppier, easier starting, and smoother running with the stock filter on there with the jetting to match. The problem there, as it were, is that the extra power meant that I did a particularly enthusiastic gear change up in a second, and the front wheel came up, and when it went back down, it jostled something loose in the fuel bowls, and the bike would no longer go faster than 40. So I rode it back home at 40 miles an hour and immediately removed the airbox, which means removing the battery, which means removing the coils and the coil drivers. I did all that, got the carbs out, and of course they were full of dirt and sediment and rust. No actual fuel garbage. There wasn't any, say, old varnish or anything in there. It was entirely sediment, so it cleaned out rather easily. And when I took out the main jet of the left carb, there was actually a chunk lodged in the jet, so there you go. What I also found was dyno jet needles and springs, but stock jets. So what I'm assuming happened is that whoever did all these mods in the first place removed the lid, added this bracket, the K&N filter, the FBF cans. That person probably did a dyno jet stage 2 in the carbs. Then, later down the line, a well-meaning owner, but probably not quite knowledgeable enough, decided to rebuild the carbs. So he got a carb rebuild kit and threw it in the carbs, but he didn't look at what came out. And he replaced those nice aftermarket parts with stock ones. And the stock jets with the dyno jet needles is a very interesting combination because it would run perfectly in very specific circumstances. But that's all fixed now. The carb is back in, and you'll remember in past videos I replaced the entire charging system, which of course means that the bike left me stranded because the battery died, because apparently something is wrong with the battery. It tests fine with every test imaginable, but it doesn't charge quite high enough, and if I'm just riding around, eventually it won't start the bike anymore. Don't know why. After 2 or 3 days of riding the Ducati, the battery will drop to 6 volts on cranking and barely turn the bike over, and then it'll just drop further and not turn the bike over at all. So I went and bought a new battery. This little guy is actually the battery design for a slightly later model, a 98 Plus Ducati 900 SS. Had to slightly modify the airbox for it to fit, but it's far easier to find. Nowhere locally actually had the correct size battery in town, and I wanted one with a warranty that I could exchange locally if wanted. Since then, the bike's been actually running great. Now that I've got the new carb kit and whatnot, it's been fairly trouble-free, and it's gained a whole heck of a lot of power with the correct jetting. I haven't really been able to do a bunch of throttle chops and check plugs. I did pull them after a ride, of course, and they looked fine, but that doesn't really cover anything other than the last 2 minutes that the engine was running. I really need to do a variety of different running conditions and then pull the plugs after each one to see what they look like, but that'll come eventually, like most things. So what's left on this bike? Well, obviously this gasket needs to be replaced. I did notice that if I accelerate particularly quickly after filling up the bike, I end up with thighs full of gasoline, which is less than ideal. So that'll need replaced. Other than that, it's mostly cosmetics. I'd really like to fix up these haggard old fairings. I guess I can put the tank back down now so it'll stop smelling like gassing. Yes, the fairings on this bike have definitely seen better days. They've got their share of nicks and bumps, and I'm not sure how well it comes across in video, but they have been spray painted. They look about as bad as the tank on that does as far as the finish goes. The real nasty bit is this massive crack here on the left side, and you can see the body filler missing. It's a pretty sad sight overall. And what's interesting is these fairings aren't even original to this bike. This is not an SSSP or an SS, I forget what the other one is, but what this is a Ducati Supersport CR, and the easiest way to tell is that there's no adjusters on these forks, and it is the lower spec rear shock. So cheaper suspension. The CR had a half fairing that actually went up and met directly with the tank. I don't quite like the look as much. I like the incredible 80s and 90s aesthetic of these full fairings, but those are gonna need to come off in order to be refinished. This is also not the right decal. This is the decal for a 96 or earlier. This is a 97. It had a big outline of the word Ducati here, and you can tell what this fairing is for because the 1997 model year had these secondary intakes up here. Earlier bikes just had a smooth section there and just this intake down here. So there you go. You're now an expert on telling different trims and model levels of 90s Ducati Supersport apart. I'm sure that's incredibly useful information that you'll all need. It is entirely too hot in here. I need a breeze. So refinishing the fairings seems like an easy enough job. Refinishing the fairings seems like it should be a fairly straightforward job. Take the fairings off, sand them down, some Bondo, some fiberglass, and then new paint and decals. But there is one step that is going to be fairly annoying, and that is the first one, taking the fairings off. And here's why. This is the only Snap-on product I own. I'm going to put it to tighten now. Yeah, it just spins forever. It does come out though. So what's happening here is what's known as well nut failure. Well, what's a well nut? Well, it's one of these things. This is a method for creating sort of a captive nut into a material, whatever you want, with a larger hole in it. What happens is, down in here is a chunk of rubber with the nut contained within it, and over time, if there's too much stuff that causes the threads to bind, you can spin the nut and then it just rotates forever inside the hole and it doesn't ever really get tight. So let's get this fairing off and I'll take a look at replacing these well nuts with this box of replacements. These are from clipsandfasteners.com. This is FBA16251-25, which are M6 well nuts. There's 25 of them. They are for a 1/2 inch hole, and I did put one in already, and they seem to be the correct size, so let's get the rest. This part of the fairing actually fits underneath this front part here, so that means that this is the well nut. You can see here, I don't know if that's in focus. You can see it's just a mushroomed out piece of rubber with a flange on this side, and as the screw goes into it, it pulls the nut and the rubber downward and makes it balloon out and holds it into the fiberglass or the metal or whatever the substrate is. Here's one that's been replaced. You can see it's not really in there quite as hard, but the metal part is a large enough diameter that it can't get pulled through the hole. And of course the observant among you will be crying and wondering why on earth I would set my fairings on the ground like that, and that's because these well nuts are so completely hashed that I can't actually get the fairings apart. So that is the main part of today's project, is making it so I can actually take these fairings apart in half like they're supposed to be. It looks like some disassembly has been done for me, but we'll have to get these out. These just spin when you try to undo them, so I might have to employ some vice grips to hold the metal, I guess it's sort of a nutsert, to hold the metal nutsert in place. As you can see here, I've already gotten this one removed, so I'm just going to go at this one now. I'm just going to use the serrated part of my knife to kind of hack away at the plastic here. Sometimes I can just sort of get started and then the rest of it just pries apart, but usually I have to cut through the whole thing. And there it is out. You can see the metal part there has been pulled down through the rubber a bit. I'll just pop out the little top piece. And then these new ones go in, not like this, like you'd expect, but instead you kind of shove them on in there. And so that's a couple of well nuts installed. I had to stop and take a Google there because I wasn't sure how these installed. They are actually supposed to be able to be installed this way because they're for blind, using them as blind fasteners as one application, but these are the exact same size. You know, here's the nut end and here's the nut end. That's exactly the same, and here's the flange. Those are exactly the same. These are the exact dimensions as these, and there's no way they're coming through this way. So yeah, I had to shove them through with a knife, as you saw. I'm going to use this lower nut right here to show you what actually happens inside of these riv nuts. So, okay, so right here when it starts to butt up against the material, you'll see it start to deform, and you can see it ballooning out there, and that is not pulling through that substrate. That is rock solid in there, and it's also cinching up around that inserted nut and keeping it from spinning, and it'll deform back a bit, mostly, as you can see, when I take the fastener out, but over time it'll probably start to mold itself into that squished shape like you saw with the old ones that I just took out. So that's 2 new riv nuts. I gotta get those off somehow. Cool. This well nut's completely disintegrated. Just the brass insert is all that's left. So let's see if we can get a clamp on that. Oh yeah, no problem, out she comes. And that right there is the remnants of the brass insert. Yeah, that's pretty much just a nutsert like you'd use when adding threads to a 3D printed project or something of that sort. Here's the interesting part with those bottom things, is the nutserts don't even go into the fairing itself. They go into these little plates that just hold the 2 halves together. So we'll get some new rubber in these guys and probably clean them up a little bit. There's only 3 left on the other side. This is actually a fairly easy job so far. Shouldn't have said that. Not bad, not bad. That looks almost like new parts. I mean, it's not amazing, but it's the best I could do with the drill-powered wire brush. My actual wire brush has completely disappeared, never to be seen again, except for when I need it the least, and it shows back up. Let's get these on the fairing. These are quite possibly the least substantial fairings in the universe. This half is done. 2 new well nuts here, a new well nut here, and I already did the well nuts on the bike. This standoff will be a future video, because that is, well, it's tragic, really. But it was there when I got the bike, so don't blame me for that. Well, it doesn't look any different, but there it is with the fairings back on. Let's just make sure it starts. Give it quite a bit of choke, because, well, even though it's hot enough for me to be sweating profusely, this is still a very cold-blooded bike. Well, there we go. I hope I was able to teach you something about well nuts. I learned a bit myself, but really, I guess I just kind of saved y'all from using Google. You're welcome. Thanks for watching.